It is a real honor to announce today's event, sponsored by Rutgers Law School and the Inclusion Project. Today's conversation deals with what I would regard as one of the most important issues of our day, and that's the issue of hate speech and the First Amendment. It's a highly complex issue, and I had the pleasure of meeting our guest today earlier, and I had framed it in some respects as a generational issue, but I don't think that's true. I'm not sure that it's a generational issue, but I know that our students and many of the millennial generation are very concerned about issues of hate speech, particularly as they lead to events such as what happened in Charlottesville. But I also remember 25 years ago, when I was an associate in a law firm, a public interest law firm, that wanted to work with the ACLU to represent a public access company who was trying to deny the right of the Ku Klux Klan to speak. And I remember the younger generation squared off against the First Amendment partnership and the older attorneys in the firm, and it was a pretty nasty, I think, back and forth in terms of what role the First Amendment has and how you reconcile that with hate speech. And we still see those issues played out most recently in Charlottesville, but I think very often. And this is just a very important issue for all of us, and I'm very proud that we have our own Professor Elise Boddie, who will introduce our guest and also introduce the conversation. So thank you all for being here.
I think that goes back over. Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Dean Lopez. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to introduce Nadine Strossen, my former colleague from New York Law School. Professor Strossen is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law at New York Law School. She has written, taught, and advocated extensively in the areas of constitutional law and civil liberties. From 1991 through 2008, she served as the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. She was the first woman to head the ACLU. She is currently a member of the ACLU's National Advisory Council, as well as the advisory boards of EPIC, Electronic Privacy Information Center, FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. When she stepped down, I think this is such a cool fact. When she stepped down as ACLU president in 2008, 3 Supreme Court justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Antonin Scalia, and David Souter, participated in her farewell and tribute luncheon. And in 2017, the American Bar Association presented Professor Strossen with the Margaret Brent Women Lawyers of Achievement Award, which celebrates the accomplishments of women lawyers who have excelled in their field and have paved the way to success for other women lawyers. The National Law Journal has named Professor Strossen one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America. We could go on and on. Professor Strossen has made thousands of public presentations, including on more than 500 campuses. She tells me that she's making at least one presentation every day, sometimes twice a day. She'll be at the University of Texas Law School tomorrow. So we are so delighted and honored to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Elise. Oops, sorry, got to turn on my.
That's all right.
Oh, no. I'm getting a red light. There we go. Thank you. It's really a delight to share the platform with you, Elise. I've missed you a lot at New York Law School, but I've really enjoyed watching the wonderful contributions you're making to justice and to countering hatred and discrimination and stereotyping.
Thank you so much for that. Much appreciated, especially coming from you. So your book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with Free Speech, Not Censorship, and you can see it on the screen, but we'll hold it up, which was published by Oxford University in May of last year. It's now required reading, I understand, for all first-year students at Washington University.
I wonder if that violates the First Amendment.
That's actually an interesting question. Maybe we could circle back to that. Do you think it violates the First Amendment?
No.
Okay, all right.
Among other things, as in a law school, wearing my constitutional law professor hat, it's a private university, so the First Amendment doesn't apply, right?
Although we have free speech norms, we'll get into that. We'll
Absolutely.
get into that in just a little bit. So I thought it would be useful to sort of start by orienting the audience definitionally so we can get on the same page. I know you've written in your book that a lot of people don't really understand that some hate speech is actually not constitutionally protected and some hate speech is constitutionally protected. So could you just sort of help educate us on the distinction?
That's a really wonderful starting point, Elise, because what I found as I was doing the research and analysis for the book, even after decades of having studied and taught First Amendment law, I gained a renewed appreciation and a refined appreciation for the very sensible line that our law draws between hate speech, and I put that in quotes because it's not a legal term of art, but I use it the way it's used in everyday speech, which is expression that conveys hateful or discriminatory or stereotyped ideas, particularly on the basis of factors such as race, religion, sexual orientation, gender, so forth, that have been the basis for discrimination and exclusion traditionally. So our legal system does not either absolutely make hate speech in that sense illegal, as many people wrongly believe. We'll often hear even government officials who should know better say hate speech is not free speech. That is not correct. There is no categorical exclusion from the First Amendment of hate speech based on its hateful or hated content. But the opposite is also not true. So you sometimes hear civil libertarians say things such as hate speech is protected. Also not true. When you get beyond the content of the speech and you look at the context, speech with a hateful message, along with any other speech, may be punished and should be punished if in the particular context it satisfies what's often summarized as the emergency test, that it directly causes certain imminent, specific, serious harm, and the only way to avert that harm is through punishing the speech. And sadly, we have a lot of hate speech incidents in this country, including on college campuses, that do satisfy the emergency principle. They constitute true threats or intentional incitement of imminent violence or targeted harassment or bullying, or even a hate crime, but that's a separate subject.
Yeah, and so, I mean, one of the, part of what I'd like us to talk about today is, first of all, so understanding what the constitutional parameters are, right? What is constitutionally permissible, what is not constitutionally permissible, and then sort of how we think about the issue normatively, right? Because we know that much of what is actually constitutional, a lot of people might not think is right.
And absolutely, the purpose of my book was not to defend constitutional principles. Actually, the main purpose of my book, as underscored by the fact that the only verb in the title is resist, and that's referring to hate. My main focus was how do we effectively resist hatred and discrimination and stereotyping. I'm absolutely convinced that censorship, as well, censorship beyond what is permitted under US law, would, even though it's well intended, do more harm than good. So purely from a policy perspective, I arrived at my conclusion that the American law actually has struck the correct balance. And much more important than me, Elise, are the many human rights activists from all over the world whom I've cited, who live in countries that do censor much more hate speech based only on the hateful or hated content. And I was really surprised to see how many of them oppose their country's censorship laws and argue that they should move more in the American direction, not at all because their country's laws violate their standards of free speech. Obviously they don't. They've got more forgiving standards, but purely from the perspective of what actually works and the counterproductive nature of these laws when they're actually enforced. Sadly, disproportionately, they are enforced to the disadvantage of people who are challenging government policies, who are promoting law reform, and most sadly, disproportionately enforced against the very minority people and perspectives that were hoped to be protected.
So just to follow up on a couple of points. So one is, again, sort of fleshing out the constitutional parameters of the discussion. And I hear you to be saying now, and I read in your book that you think that the law is just about right. One issue that surfaces quite a bit is the risk of viewpoint discrimination, right? Punishing particular people because of the viewpoints that they're expressing. And then also the the problem with censorship is that it's inevitably overbroad, right? That you're punishing too much speech. And you've said here, and you said in the book, that basically the cure is worse than the disease, that there's a risk of sort of weaponizing hate speech against groups that are minoritized and marginalized, and I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I guess one of the questions that I have, just following up on that, is still there are costs to free speech, and so I want to talk about the cost of free speech and the role of power in that conversation, because we see so often that the cost of free speech, on the one hand, we have sort of the risks that hate speech could be targeted towards marginalized groups, but at the same time, right, the costs of free speech are often borne by marginalized, minoritized groups, the least powerful. And so how do we think about that? How would you respond to that observation?
There are several responses, but and in my book, in addition to quoting human rights activists from many other countries, to make it clear that I'm not this carpetbagging American that's preaching to the rest of the world, but quoting people from other countries themselves, I also quote many, many minority group leaders, including politicians and activists and educators, who themselves are saying, yes, we know that the harm, at least potential harm, is severe. We know that the burden of counterspeech may fall disproportionately upon members of minority groups, but you really owe it to yourselves to do this. And I'm actually, you can see I have been speaking a lot.
Oh, I'm going to take some water while you're drinking water too.
One of the people that I'm channeling when I say that is Barack Obama, and one of the places where he made those points was at Rutgers University in the last year of his presidency. I believe he gave a commencement address here. And this became a big refrain for him, but he's typical of others, minority group leaders who are completely, unfortunately, empathetic with the harm that hate speech can cause. And I think nothing would be worse than seeing your daughters subjected to this vitriolic expression, and yet absolutely convinced that not only is the cure worse than the disease, but if you are to achieve racial justice and social justice and all these other wonderful causes that campus activists are struggling for, you cannot do it effectively unless you're willing to confront those who are disparaging you. Now, Elise, I also have to say, and I quote, among the people I quote on this point is your former LDF colleague, Ted Shaw, who very, very strongly also supports the anti-censorship position, including for some interesting legal reasons, but that's probably too detailed. But he and I both make the same point, which is that all of us constantly have a responsibility to speak up, to denounce hateful ideas wherever they occur immediately, regardless of whether you are a member of the disparaged group. I, as a Jew and as a woman, I'm fairly often subject to hate speech, but way beyond that, whoever is disparaged, and to also speak up to affirm constantly the positive values of equality and diversity and dignity, inclusivity, societal harmony, and individual mental health. Now, so a big part of my book is what should we do? And I think we all can make a very big difference. That was the negative part of my research, was that I found that censorship was even less effective than I had thought it would be. But the positive part, and I'm an activist, so I always see the glass half full. The positive part is that non-censorial strategies, including education and outreach and support for those who are disparaged, creating a positive climate, can really do so much good. Last week I'm really dipping into the social science a lot, because I know you're aware of it. We've talked about it via email. There is social science research that suggests that the potential traumatic impact of being subject to hateful speech, which has not only psychological and emotional impacts, and I say only, not in a just a demeaning sense, not solely psychological and emotional impacts, but also physiological. I take those very seriously. But what's so interesting is that the social psychologists who have documented those harms say that those harms can well be countered by raising our voices, by providing support, and on campuses, the potential of hate speech to do damage, including psychologically and physiologically, is much, much less and can be reduced to the point of zero if you are proactive and have a positive, equal, inclusive community in which everybody feels that they belong as a full-fledged participant and member, and that they're respected. Once you have that positive climate, hate mongers really can do much less harm. So that's a constant mandate for all of us, not to wait for the hate mongers to come to campus, but to always be positively creating that kind of inclusive environment.
So let me follow up on 2 points, because those are very powerful ideas. One is on the sort of the science of hate speech, and you and I had I think a brief exchange about this over email. So Richard Friedman, who is a clinical professor of clinical psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times back in November called "The Neuroscience of Hate Speech." And in this op-ed, he talked about how repeated exposure to hate speech can increase prejudice and desensitize individuals to verbal aggression because it sort of normalizes socially abhorrent behavior. He also mentioned that there's a biochemical response when people hear hate speech. On the other side of this, it can kind of excite them to violence. Again, there, as you've already mentioned, there is some kind of, biochemical, psychological conditioning that happens as a result of hearing hate speech. So as we think about the constitutional calculus, right, and we're balancing the benefits of free speech against the harms, how does that sort of neuroscience, you talked about the social science, I don't know if, the neuroscience.
I'm sorry, I intended to include the neuroscience. And absolutely, I always tell my students in constitutional law, now you're not to make policy arguments, you are to make constitutional law arguments, but actually, as I also explained to them, the policy arguments are really folded into the constitutional law analysis, right? So many of you have already taken it. You know that even such a fundamental right as freedom of speech is not absolute. I don't know any, even most ardent civil libertarian, who contends that it should be absolute. We simply say that government has a very heavy burden of proof to show that the restriction is necessary to promote a countervailing goal of compelling importance. It's a no-brainer that equality and diversity and all of the goals that are asserted by those who support hate speech restrictions, those are compelling. So the real test is this restriction necessary? And if I were persuaded that by neuroscience, social science, any other evidence that a hate speech restriction was effective and even more so, the least restrictive way to accomplish those goals, I would be all in favor, Elise, and I think that judges applying strict scrutiny would have to as well. But I'm not persuaded by the evidence because first of all, while the harm is, there's a lot of evidence that the harm might be inevitable. That's debated among social scientists, including those who sent in letters commenting saying, no, the harm is not inevitable. There are proactive steps we can take to prevent it, including through cognitive behavior therapy that trains all of us to develop mindsets of resilience. And in my book, I quote some of those social psychologists, as well as, again, the educators and the political activists who, just from an on-the-street perspective, say, hey, wait, if you're going to be an effective advocate, you've got to train yourself not to allow yourself to be disparaged. And one famous statement that I think of that well sums that up is Michelle Obama famously saying, when they go low, we go high, right? You're not going to allow them to disparage you. You can look down on them. There's something else that I learned as a result of the book, quite frankly, that had not occurred to me before because my exercise of my free speech as an activist and as an educator has always been to large audiences like this. And I had thought of this as a matter of persuading. You argue in favor of all of these wonderful values of inclusion and diversity, but it turns out if you're to persuade somebody who is attracted to or already involved in a white supremacist organization, for example, it's really probably not going to work to engage in a rational debate. And what I learned very hearteningly were just amazing stories of people who have reached out in a one-on-one basis to create empathetic, compassionate relationships with people they deeply disagree with. They're not, of course, compassionate toward the ideas, but they're not rejecting the person as a human being. And I've now delved very much into this literature and am really inspired by the number of even former leaders of hate-monger organizations who have been, and the term that they use is redeemed. And more has been written about what are the strategies that are effective. And not surprisingly, the restorative justice to apply in that context, something really to think about. I want to, you had mentioned just a moment ago that when you can create inclusive environments, that helps to hateful ideas, the spread of hateful ideas. And I want to sort of talk about that specifically in the context of a university environment. And one way of thinking about what you said is that in that context we need students, right? So if speakers come to campus to sort of stand up and protest, counter-protest, counterspeech is really the best way to address that. And I guess so one of the, again going back to the question of power in that context, and how we think about the role of students in resisting free speech, and students who, we're in a law school here, right? We serve the students, right? So the students are the sort of the lifeblood of the institution. But as a student, it could also be very disempowering to sort of feel like you're in an environment where you have a speaker who is coming to campus, who is expressing views that you feel may not be hate speech in the sense of the Constitution, but still are very deeply disempowering and kind of and offensive.
And I want to just ask you if you could just comment on a controversy that has come out of the University of Chicago Law School. And Jeffrey Stone, who is a very prominent constitutional law scholar and First Amendment scholar.
The editor of my book.
The editor of your book, for decades has used the N-word in his class on free speech. I'm not going to use the word. And as I understand it, he has since said that he would not do that any longer.
In response to student protests, which
Yeah,
shows that student protests can and should be powerful.
Yeah, there was a student in his class who wrote an op-ed who actually walked out of his class when Professor Stone used the word. And just to contextualize it, Professor Stone had used it to demonstrate fighting words doctrine, as I understand it, which are kind of constitutionally not protected because they are considered low-value speech, because their sole purpose is really to incite a fight. The Black Law Students Association had also protested the word. And again, Professor Stone has since said that he would no longer use it in class, but Balsa has been critical of the law school's silence on the issue. And they wrote a letter to the law school where they said they were pulling out of Admitted Students Weekend because they were dissatisfied with the law school's response. And what they said was, I'm quoting from the letter, this silence has manifested a culture where a Black student's right to learn, engage, and excel is overshadowed by the need to preserve the interest of the oppressor's unequivocal right to speak freely. And I should say too, I do not use the word in my constitutional law class. I do show clips of Eyes on the Prize. I showed a clip of the Bloody Sunday, the March on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where the word is used fairly liberally. I do try to warn students so that they know that that's coming. But you still have to worry about the psychic costs of that for students who are sitting and trying to learn and having to absorb the history, wrap their mind around that, and then also sort of be engaged in the the conversation. So just reactions, thoughts?
Oh, yes, and thank you for telling me that latest development, which I had not known, that there's been criticism that the university has not spoken up. Because I'm speaking there next week, so I will definitely bone up on that last detail. But one of the examples I give I have a whole chapter about counterspeech, which is amazingly varied. As I said, I tend to think of it as a former student activist as protest, which I absolutely support and encourage, or education or information. I've already talked about reaching out compassionately. But self-restraint is definitely a very important example and can go a long way. And in my book, I give the exact same example that you do, Elise. That chapter comes near the end of the book, and so I say readers may have noticed that I use the phrase the N-word every time the actual word appears, even if I'm quoting a Supreme Court opinion. So there was a legitimate reason for using the word. And there's one exception, which I'll tell you about in a moment, but I explained that I made that judgment exercising my free speech right, which entails the right to decide both what to say, what not to say, how to phrase what you are saying. And I think all of us have to be very sensitive to the potential negative power of words and to a cost-benefit analysis. How much is added by using the actual word itself? How much is subtracted? I have been criticized, not surprisingly, by people who say, oh, that was too much self-censorship. Fine, when you write your book, you can do it a different way. Because I think it's just not only the risk of, unnecessarily upsetting students, but then it becomes a distraction from the lesson that you're trying to teach, and in my case, the message of my book. The one exception I made was Barack Obama, and you may remember he did a podcast interview toward the end of his presidency, and very large audience, and he made a point that substantively is another point that accords with my book, when he said, in this country, it is no longer acceptable to say, and then he said the word. And then he sort of says, well, big deal. What about the structural racism that still permeates this society, that's still pervasive throughout the criminal justice system? What about the entrenched segregation that thankfully people like Elise are struggling against? You know, so and that, I do feel that sometimes there are, of course, you can be concerned about words and about structural racism, but sometimes I think for too many politicians, it becomes a quick fix to say, and certainly at the university level, you know, we're doing something to promote equality, we're banning certain words, where they're not doing the harder, deeper, more expensive, more resource-intense work that we need to create the kinds of inclusive communities that we've already talked about.
And so, and I take it, just to kind of close the loop on the point, that it would not be appropriate or perhaps constitutional to tell Professor Stone you cannot use that word. That would definitely be unconstitutional. I think
you know, it's a private university, but one that
famously
has adhered to, bragged about choosing to adhere to free speech norms. And here is actually a difference that Jeff and I had as he was editing my book, and I think this may explain why the law school did not take a position on this issue. The University of Chicago adopted in, I believe, the late 60s, something called the Calvin Report, in which they said that the university as an entity, and I assume that means subparts of the university such as the law school, should not take any positions on controversial issues. So Jeff actually thought that it would be inappropriate for the president of the university, the dean of the law school, et cetera, to denounce hateful speech, whereas I disagree with that. I think that's a very, very important action, a constructive action that should be engaged in by the law school or the university. After all, if you're affirmatively celebrating free speech principles, as Chicago famously does, you should co-equally celebrate principles of diversity and equality and non-discrimination. But so I disagree with that strategy of not, you know, not censoring him, but expressing their views, their commitment to equality and inclusivity.
Thank you for that. And I want to be mindful of the time so that we can leave plenty of time for Q&A. There were two other questions that I wanted to see if I could sneak in. One is about the president's executive order, which requires universities to promote free inquiry and free and open debate or risk their federal funding. He has directed the heads of various agencies to take appropriate steps, air quote, to ensure institutions that receive federal research grants are promoting free inquiry. Some constitutional law scholars, including Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean at UC Berkeley Law School, Robert Zimmer, the president of University of Chicago, has suggested there could be some constitutional concerns in the sense that it opens up universities to political interference and government bureaucracy. Do you think the order are there constitutional concerns about the order from your perspective?
I do have constitutional concerns and general free speech concerns. I do want to stress, Elise, that this is not a partisan comment. I would not trust any government official to make what are often delicate judgment determinations. When does a vigorous protest by students cross the line to be disruptive and therefore unprotected? It's a matter of judgment, and I would much rather trust the judgment of university officials who are steeped in principles of academic freedom and free speech than a government bureaucrat. Unfortunately, we've seen how the free speech issue on campus has been politicized, mostly used, quite frankly, by conservative officials and commentators to selectively cherry pick and criticize incidents where conservative speakers have been subject to having their speech suppressed. There are plenty of incidents, including at least one recently on this campus, where people who are expressing a liberal point of view are subject to various, at least, attempts to suppress them. And I doubt that the Department of Education would pay as much attention to those. Certainly the Justice Department recently has made a big cause to protect free speech on campus, but so far they have not come to the defense of a liberal speaker or student who has been suppressed.
So just moving on, I'm going to try to sneak in one more question in the time that we have left so we can have time for Q&A. We've sort of been hinting at the role of constitutional norms in free speech, and private speech. And I want to talk about Facebook. We obviously have this unbelievably horrific terrorist attack on the mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. The gunman who committed the attacks live streamed 17 minutes of the attack. Facebook has said that out of respect for the people who were killed in the attack, that it has removed 1.5 million videos of the attack and blocked another 1.2 million from being uploaded. I think you've suggested in your book that you think private online platforms, particularly those who exercise power, we've been talking about the role of power, should hold themselves to the same standards as the government when it comes to free speech. What are your views?
I think I've evolved a little bit in that view. I mean, the basic point that even though they are not literally subject to First Amendment constraints, we should still find some other way of protecting free speech and other countervailing values, which certainly include public safety. And in some countries, Facebook is essentially equated with the internet, and the spread through Facebook of rumors and revenge narratives has seemed to have led to massacres of the Rohingya in Myanmar and in India of ethnic and religious minorities. So we have to try to do something despite the fact that the Constitution doesn't provide tools. The social media companies themselves are obviously feeling the pressure. They're talking more and more about self-restraint. Mark Zuckerberg issued yet another op-ed in the Washington Post over the weekend to that effect. What I do want to warn, though, is we should harbor no illusion that the bros of Silicon Valley would do any better than Big Brother in the government in enforcing these inherently subjective concepts of hate speech. For one person's hate speech is somebody else's loving speech. Since 2014, there's been a very large coalition of civil rights and civil liberties organizations. About 77 organizations, including the ACLU and the NAACP, have complained to Facebook that it is disproportionately enforcing its anti-hate speech standards against, three guesses, against Black Lives Matter protesters, against pipeline protesters, against anybody who's complaining about abuses in the criminal justice system. And a number of civil rights activists have actually called Facebook racebook. And there are now there's now evidence that algorithms, since they're designed by humans, I guess we shouldn't be so surprised, but that they also are showing racial biases. An African-American woman, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name, I just came across a book, wrote a new book called Algorithms of Oppression, in which she seriously documents that pattern. So we have to do something, but we have to tread very, very carefully.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. So we're at the time for questions. We have microphones on either side, so if folks could line up to ask questions, that would be terrific. And don't be shy. We'll just alternate sides.
Wow, that's a tall mic.
Yeah, you could.
Sure.
Oh,
Hello, my name is Omar Rana. So I wish I could have looked this up on my phone, but unfortunately I left it upstairs, so I was not able to. But I believe I read recently